well, we can go ahead and get started. My name's Kirsten Galinsky. I'm the chapter leader for AFF-Milwaukee. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us for this part 3 series in our National Criminal Justice Reform series. Today we have Criminal Justice Fellow Greg Glod from Americans for Prosperity, and a fellow AFF-Milwaukee board member and my colleague at the Badger Institute, Julie Grace, with us to discuss correctional community corrections reform. So I'll hand it over to Julie if she would like to begin.
Thanks, Kirsten. It's fun to be on this side of the webinar for the first time. Glad to be here. Like Kirsten said, I'm a policy analyst at the Badger Institute, where I mainly research on criminal justice policies as well as occupational licensing. I can go ahead and give maybe a little bit of a brief overview, and then we can turn to Greg if that works. So I'm really glad that AFF is doing this series, and I'm really excited to talk about community corrections today, because the way I see it is it's a really large part of the criminal justice system that oftentimes is overlooked, because when we think of criminal justice reform, we often think of prisons. We don't think of the people who are serving their sentence or part of their sentence actually in the community. However, at least in Wisconsin, and I'll talk mostly Wisconsin today, Greg will pick up the national perspective. At least in Wisconsin, there's actually 3 times as many people on community supervision as there are in prisons. And so community corrections is kind of like a catch-all term for probation and extended supervision and parole, and we can get into more of what that all means and some of the research that we've done on the issues. But really excited to talk about this, just because, like I said, it's such a large part of criminal justice that oftentimes just gets overlooked.
Thanks, Julie. And yeah, my name is Greg Glod. I am the policy fellow at Americans for Prosperity. Thank you for having me on today. Just kind of a recap, Americans for Prosperity is a grassroots organization that has 35 active chapters across the country, one being in Wisconsin. Shout out to Eric Bott, our state director over there, and Megan Novak, who does some incredible work on criminal justice. I know they work very closely with Julie, as well over at Badger, who does phenomenal work on criminal justice, some of the most top-notch stuff across the country. So really appreciate a lot of the work that you guys have been doing in Wisconsin. So Americans for Prosperity works on a lot of different issues, including healthcare, education, fiscal responsibility, and also criminal justice. So I predominantly work on criminal justice reform issues. And like Julie said, community supervision is one of the main drivers of our prison population. We think about community supervision almost as a get out of jail free card. Like, hey, instead of giving you a 5-year sentence, we're going to put you on probation. You better not mess up, or else you're going to come back in. And we think of this as a great second chance for people to continue to work in their community safely, get their lives back together, everything else. When you really start digging deeper into the numbers, you really start to see that it's actually this major driver of the prison population. So I think nationally, 45% of all prison admissions come from supervision violations. And 25% of those are all technical violations. So you have 2 different types of ways to get revoked. You commit a new crime, they send you back to prison, or you commit a technical violation based upon missing a meeting, failing a drug test, things of that nature. And that really causes a considerable amount of strain and resources and focus away from some of the higher risk individuals that we want in prison, rather than the people that are just making mistakes. And so seeing that type of numbers increase based upon an area of the law that's supposed to be this alternative to prison, pretty much turning into another route into prison, really makes you think that we really need to get back to what the actual intention of parole, what the intention of probation, what the intention of community supervision and extended release are. And this really gets back into a lot of ways with what's going on with policing right now today as well. So you have, most of the probation supervisees are out in predominantly minority communities. You have more police there. And so when you're bringing people back into the criminal justice system, not because of a new criminal offense or anything, you're actually bringing them back in for, like I said, a failed drug test or something like that. and you have more police contacts, that's going to turn into more people being revoked from those communities. So a lot of the criminal justice contacts that you see in urban communities are from individuals that are coming from probation or parole, having more contacts with police arresting them on something, that turning into a revocation, and that cycle starts all over again. And so a lot of the connections with some of the current environment between policing and their communities, a lot of it does have to do with some of the community supervision policies that have put into place in Wisconsin and other states across the country. So really excited to talk about this tonight. Think it's a really, really important conversation. And like Julie said, something that doesn't really get a lot of attention, mandatory minimums and other things kind of take a lot of the air out of the criminal justice arena. But I think this is one of the really main underlying drivers of our prison population and why the United States is such a over-reliance on the prison system.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Julie, if you want to go ahead and
Sure. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. But just a few things to reiterate what Greg was saying on a Wisconsin level, because that'll be my role here. Just last week, I was looking at recent data that the Wisconsin Department of Corrections released that essentially was an Excel spreadsheet of everyone in a state prison today. And if you filter by people who are just in for a new sentence, that made up about actually half. I think it was around 10,000, 10 or 11,000. The other half of people in a Wisconsin prison is what I would kind of consider the cycle, the churn from probation or extended supervision. And that's not to say all of them have not committed a new crime. Some of them are back because they committed a new crime while they were on extended supervision or probation. But when I broke that down, it's just kind of shocking, when you think that half of the people in prison have been there before, were released onto extended supervision or probation, and then were revoked. I'll back up just a little bit so that people know exactly what these terms are that we're talking about, just so we're clear. So probation is an alternative to incarceration. So like Greg said, you go to court, you don't get a prison sentence, but you get probation. And so basically that's serving your time in the community. In Wisconsin, we also have what's called extended supervision, which after truth in sentencing was passed here about 20 years ago, that law required that everyone who went to prison would serve their whole time. And then they would also serve 25% of their prison sentence in the community. And so that's what we call extended supervision. Kirsten, I can go into a little bit of the research that we've done recently, if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. So a few years ago, we were super interested in determining why so many people on supervision fail. So, we hear these numbers about technical violations and crimeless revocation, which is when people are sent back to prison, sometimes for a new crime, sometimes not. And we wanted to know why. Why are these people being sent back? Unfortunately, that's not a data point that we know. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections does not publish why revocations occur, which we would love to know. And so it's hard when you hear these anecdotes of people perhaps missing a meeting and being sent back to prison, or being caught drinking and being sent back to prison. Then you also hear horrible stories of crimes. And so, we wanted to kind of have a comprehensive look of what's going on. And so we work with a UW law professor, Cecilia Klingel. She's an expert on this issue in the country. And Cecilia looked at 189 revocation cases, which is the termination of supervision when someone is sent back to prison. She looked at 189 cases kind of throughout the state of Wisconsin. So it was a representative sample. She found that, I'm gonna look at my notes here. About half, I think, about half were going back for technical violations, and about half were going back for a new crime. What gets even more complicated is when we start looking at, okay, what are the technical violations or the crimeless revocations that are occurring that are sending people back? The highest reasons, the most reasons that she found were absconding, which means that you don't check in with your probation officer or you kind of disappear. Failure to complete an alternative to revocation, which means you were given kind of like a last chance and you failed to complete that. And what was the one other one? Battery or assault, but there wasn't a charge. And so there's a great report on our website. I'd be happy to share it with anyone. But my biggest takeaway from Cecilia's research, and I know it's not pretty and wrapped up in a box and we can just present it to people, is that this is really, really messy. It's really hard to define what a crimeless revocation is. It's not defined in state statute. Oftentimes we hear these horrible examples of these crimeless revocations occurring. And then, you also hear examples of, well, perhaps that was just the last straw, So that was one of the main findings from Cecilia's research. She also found that a large portion, I think it was like 89% of the cases that she examined had substance abuse or alcohol abuse problems. And so there are certainly issues that need to be resolved, but the programming that the Department of Corrections provides is simply not suited to serve a lot of these individuals. And so they're released to probation or extended supervision, expecting to, follow all the rules, and the services just aren't there. Another main finding, and I'll get into this more, was that Wisconsin, unlike many other states, actually does not cap the amount of time that you can be on extended supervision or probation. And so what we found is that sometimes people are serving 5, 10 plus years on community supervision. And of course, the longer that you watch someone and make them follow rules, the more likely they are to mess up. But additionally, people, and research shows this, are more likely to mess up kind of right when they're released. And so therefore, the public safety benefit of supervising individuals really post 3 to 5 years, it's not there. And so those were just kind of a few of the main findings from that report. Super interesting, and Cecilia did a great job on it for us. So I just wanted to mention that, and I can speak on it more if you'd like, or if there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Greg, if you wanted to provide a national perspective to kind of that report, if you have any.
Absolutely. And, in Wisconsin in particular, and this is across the country, the types of, conditions that are put on supervision are so long, arbitrary, overly broad, and sometimes don't really have a lot of connection to the underlying offense. And so you have these broad things of not associating with known felons. You have don't drink or smoke cigarettes or anything, and your crime was like petty theft. It's all these different things where you can't go outside these limits or somewhere else. And depending on your probation officer, they could warn you at that point. They can nab you. They can throw you back in jail and wait. And so there's such an arbitrary nature to supervision that you don't know when you're going to be busted for a very minor infraction that's going to put you back in prison for 4 or 5 years. And so it's not conducive to public safety. It's not helpful for the individual, their family, or the taxpayer who's fitting that cost of housing that individual for not even committing a new offense in a lot of regards, and putting them into prison for another $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. And so, a lot of states have really started to focus, what they're doing on community supervision and making reforms that have been shown to have better success for the individual and also for the taxpayer. And so, there's things such as graduated sanctions. And so it actually allows for the probation officer to say, okay, well, you missed a meeting. So under the statute now, I have this matrix, which kind of shows like you've committed one technical violation. I'm going to throw you in jail for a weekend. Okay, you failed a drug test. All right, instead of throwing you back in prison, because obviously there might be some underlying problems with drug addiction, I'm going to have you put in more intensive treatment, or I'm going to have you drug tested more often, or I'm going to throw you in jail for a weekend and bring you back out and try to do this. So these swift and certain sanctions that are just minor have a much better effect and impact on an individual for successful reentry into society than a long prison sentence would. And so 28 states across the country have implemented some sort of graduated sanctions model. The most recent one of them is Utah. If you look that up, they have a really great matrix and sensing model that's really easy to understand and kind of just has a rubric of what you've done and what happened. So everyone kind of knows what the consequences are, because there's a lot of arbitrariness in what the punishments are in a lot of states right now, and particularly in Wisconsin. What's going to get you back landed in prison or not? And so that's a major issue. Another thing that's been occurring across the country is earned compliance credits. So actually having incentive to do the right things while you're on probation. This is a major sticking point in Wisconsin as well, because you really don't get any compliance credits for actually having good behavior on supervision. You can be revoked back even for those years that you've actually been in compliance. And so that's why you see certain folks ping-ponging back and forth from prison back to supervision, back to prison, back to supervision. They have these extended sentences like Julie were talking about, far longer than they were supposed to when they were sentenced initially. And so a variety of states have implemented what are earned compliance credits. So if you participate in programming, get your GED, earn a college degree or a high school diploma, participate in alcohol treatment or something like that, you can actually get time off your supervision to move on forward within, with your life. And so Missouri is a good example of a state that's done that. Mississippi is a good example of a state that has done that. Texas is a great example of the states that's done that. North Carolina, Georgia, all these different states. And we're looking at conservative states, Democrat states. Like, this is across the board, bipartisan issue where individuals have allowed for those compliance credits to have a much more successful reentry moving forward. Capping probation lengths is a major issue that Julie just discussed. Pennsylvania is about to pass a bill that caps probation lengths at 5 years for a felony, 3 years at a misdemeanor, where you're supposed to presume to be let off of probation at that point. And another thing is caseload reduction. So a lot of the times probation officers have 100, 120, sometimes 200 people that they're supervising. And all that you're really able to ask at that point is, are you paying your fees? Are you clean right now? Have you committed any crimes? And then they're moving on. And so that's not really getting to the underlying causes of why they're committing offenses. It's not getting into individualized programming and treatment. And that's going to come out to worse caseloads. So Texas actually really showed a great gold standard on how to work this. They provided specific grants to probation departments to reduce their amount of caseloads and trying to reduce the amount of people that they're revoking back to prison. And those counties that actually took those grants had much significantly lower revocations back to prison than the ones that did not, and saved hundreds of millions of dollars for Texas in the long run there. And so showing that when you reduce those caseloads, let probation officers, parole officers work with the individual and make these kind of much more holistic approaches to supervision, you're going to get better results for the individual, the taxpayer, and public safety at large. And so those are just a few of the types of reforms that we've seen across the country really work, be evidence-based, work in large jurisdictions, rural jurisdictions, urban jurisdictions. They really don't have an area where, well, it works here, it doesn't work over there. It's really worked across the board, a lot of these reforms. And so we're hoping that Wisconsin can follow the lead of a lot of other states across the country there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the compliance credits that you mentioned. So if we've seen it be successful in so many of these other states, why is it not more widely used in the other states, such as Wisconsin?
Good question. Well, I mean, a lot of it has to, I can put my T4 hat on for a second here. A lot of it has to do with, politics. Wisconsin right now, you have a split, legislature and executive that has kind of caused some friction, particularly in criminal justice, to move things forward. And prior to that, there just was not committee makeup and legislative makeup to allow for some of these reforms to move forward. Really, all it takes is just one chairman, one person that has a lot of opinion either on the inside of the legislature or on the outside to really break up a lot of these reforms for moving forward. I mean, our system's meant to be really hard to pass a bill, and I think that's a good thing. So, you see a state like Wisconsin who goes full time in their session as well. There's not a sense of urgency for a lot of these things. So a lot of it kind of gets kicked down the road. You get to slow play it because, hey, we can do that in December. Oh, we can just come back in February. Oh, we'll come back in March. We're going to have a hearing on this in June. We're going to do a study on this in July. And if you have an individual who does not want to see movement and reform in these areas, there's a possibility that can can kind of stall and stammer. But and then the other part of it is, even if you pass a bill or that looks perfect on paper, has great earned compliance credit, incentivized grants, all these things, it's only worth the individuals that are actually going to implement it at the local level. And so law enforcement in particular is hyper local. So you need to have individuals that are bought in to these practices. And in many jurisdictions, if you don't have the judges, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the sheriff, the warden at the prison all bought into this holistic approach, you're really going to not see the results that you're intended. So in the jurisdictions that you've really seen probation reform work, you've seen that, connection between the public defender, the prosecutor, the judge, all coming together and saying, there's a better way to do this, and we're going to work together with our resources and utilize taxpayer dollars in a much more productive manner than we were before. If not, if one of those little keys doesn't want to follow, the whole thing can really topple. So I know that's a convoluted answer, but it's a convoluted issue. And so that's really, it's willpower of, bureaucrats and lawmakers at the end of the day. That's what it's going to come down to.
Yeah, no, thank you for providing that insight. We do have another question in the chat box. What crimes are eligible for probation rather than imprisonment? And then what states are using probation to the greatest extent? And are there any crimes that probation leads to recidivism and imprisonment would be better?
So I'll start with the first one. Julie, you may have some more information on specific for Wisconsin. So every state's a little different. There's some states that disallow for probation for certain offenses, and you probably can kind of guess the ones, murder, arson, sexual assault, those type of aggravated assault, the higher level ones. But some states allow it and allow wide discretion for judges to implement probation, even if there's a mandatory minimum sentence. So Texas is a good example of that. Everything up to second-degree murder, you can actually get a deferred sentence, which says, we'll put you on supervision, and if you comply, we'll actually dismiss your case. And so it's essentially kind of put in this weird box of, you've admitted fault, but if you can kind of comply, we will dismiss your charge later on. And so for a lot of states, there's really not a lot of, exclusions for probation, but some do. Mississippi is a good example where you're ineligible for parole or probation if it's on your second offense, for example, or if it's a higher level drug offense, or what they call a crime of violence. But crime of violence, the definition there is a lot of different things that actually don't include violence. And so that gets a little complicated. So sorry to not be able to answer your question, but it varies across state lines. Julie, do you have any other information on that from Wisconsin standpoint? I don't think they have too many restrictions.
I don't think there are honestly any restrictions, but I could be wrong on that. But I don't believe so.
I believe there's a couple of mandatory, there's sentences where that requires prison, and then you're required to have supervision after that.
For all prison sentences, you're required to serve, it's 25% of that time, of the prison sentence time in the community. So, but besides, and so extended supervision and probation are kind of similar in that sense, but I'm not sure about crimes that are only eligible for probation or not.
Yeah, I know Florida, for example, for drug trafficking offenses, you're ineligible for probation. You have to serve your sentence out. And so there's a lot of those mandatory sentences that require that at the federal level, mandatory minimum drug sentences, which kind of encapsulates any drug offense. At the federal level, you have to serve a certain amount of prison time. You can't go on to supervision or something along those lines. And I'm sorry, I forgot the other two questions that were in there.
No problem. I kind of bombarded you. The second one is, what states are using probation to the greatest extent?
It's a really good
Minnesota?
question. Minnesota does
the one
quite a
people
bit.
look at a lot?
Yeah, Minnesota does quite a bit. I know Texas utilizes it quite a bit. And like I said, they utilize that deferred sentence very routinely. A lot of the states, I'll go kind of the other way with it. A lot of the states that have these mandatory minimum and truth in sentencing laws, like Wisconsin or Arizona or Florida, are the ones that really don't utilize it as often. And then there's some states that utilize it considerably, but they revoke individuals off it so much that it's pretty much not probation at that point. Tennessee is a really good example of that with probation and parole. They have these lengthy probation sentences that they put on people, kind of understanding that this person may fail. And so they're allowed to kind of plea out, and it's part of the plea bargaining process where they'll say, hey, we'll give you 6 years probation because I know you won't plead to 6 years, but we'll probably get you on the back end there and get you in prison one way or the other. And so it can be utilized as kind of like a tool to render out plea bargains, knowing that the result's probably going to be the same. So, that's a little complicated as well, but it really does depend on the state, who's utilizing what and what's the actual outcome for probation at the end there.
All right, and then the final one that was included is, are there any crimes that probation leads to recidivism and imprisonment would be better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily the crime you have to look at. There's sometimes the individual. And so, I've been to probably, 30 prisons at this point across the country through my work as an attorney, and then also through this work in criminal justice. And so you talk to individuals, and there are these guys in there, they're like, I've been through this, my third stint in prison. I was on probation my first time. I was a dumb kid. I was 22. I still had drug problems. I just wasn't ready. And so I got right back in. And I wasn't ready again, and I got right back in. And having, this structure and being a little bit older and mature, I felt like I was ready, and, I'm cleaned out. I have a job lined up on the back end. And so it's really not necessarily the offense itself. It's probably much more the underlying issues of that person, where they are in life. And then also the type of supervision that they're getting. A lot of the times, these first interactions with the criminal justice system are really just, hey, don't do it again. We're going to throw you right back out in the system that you were in. And what's going to happen? You're just going to go back to your old habits and be revoked back into there. Or you're going to spend, a year in prison or jail. You're going to go right back on the streets without a job, with a felony conviction now, so good luck getting a job. And you're more than likely going to go right back into that system. And so sometimes it's not necessarily the crime, it's the person, and then also what type of treatment or programming or whatever other opportunities there were while they were on supervision or while they were in prison. That's what's going to more garner the successful outcomes than necessarily an offense. So for a lot of folks, they could have this, robbery charge that looks like they're a very violent person. They robbed strong-armed a bank or something like that. That person might be more amenable to treatment and programming for an underlying drug addiction than someone with what's considered like a nonviolent offense. And so these kind of terms and categories really oscillate with depending on why the individual is committing crimes in the first place, rather than what that crime actually ventured out into be from the actual charge.
Yeah, and going off, the drug and alcohol addiction, someone did message me the question, what impact, if any, are you seeing with the legalization of marijuana on community corrections?
If you want to take anything.
Well, it's obviously in Wisconsin not legal, so we haven't seen. I would love to know if it were, how that would impact both community corrections and revocations. I suspect there aren't that many people sitting in prison for low-level marijuana offenses, I guess I'll call them. But, that might play a role in revocations, I would assume. And would certainly, I would also assume, help lower the community supervision and revocation rate. But I don't know, Greg, have you looked at that at any states that have legalized?
Yeah, I'll give much more kind of high level than, hard statistics. If you're looking at states like, Colorado, Washington, Washington, D.C., which is where I live, it's quasi decriminalized legal. It's not too hard to purchase at a store if you're really looking for it or get something. So, in those places, I think the bigger issue with the legalization, the decriminalization, or the defelonization of simple drug possession in some states like Oklahoma and Utah, when you make it a criminal offense or you decriminate or make it legalized, now the criminal justice system cannot be triggered. And so when the criminal justice system can be triggered, the full freight of the government and law enforcement can be weighed on that. And so no longer can you get pulled over for a traffic stop and then the faint smell of marijuana is coming from the car, they find a joint, and now they can arrest you, search your car, and deprive you a lot of these, simple liberties and protections that the Fourth Amendment is supposed to guarantee. And so a lot of it much more has to do with how that reduces contacts with police. with the criminal justice system, because that's no longer an offense. Obviously, you can't just be smoking on the street or whatever else. You can't drive while you're high or anything along those lines. But it really limits those types of contacts with the criminal justice system. And I can't tell you how many times, those warrants are, started, or the searches start, or the arrests start because of that. And then also just from the community supervision side, no longer if it's legal or you have a medical marijuana license or something like that, can that be used as a trigger for a revocation? Now, there are some states that are trying to say, if the judge says you can't have your marijuana card, then you can't have your marijuana card and you can still get revoked back for it. Pennsylvania, there was some language in a bill right now that's working through that would reform their probation system, and that was language in there, and that's finally being removed out thanks to activists from AFP and from a great SPN group out there, the Commonwealth Fund, and a lot of other groups that have been working on that bill. Hopefully that'll stay out of the final language, because there's obviously a reason that they have that medical marijuana card, and we want to make sure individuals that are getting treatment through marijuana are not being denied that because of their status on probation. So there's definitely going to be a positive impact in that regard. It's just one less thing to get revoked off of in a lot of ways. So a little more anecdotal, but that's my sense of the question.
Yeah, thank you. And so what is the most, someone else asked me this question, what is the most surprising thing you both have learned during your research of community corrections nationally and based in Wisconsin?
What I always come back to is, I'm going to sound like a boring policy analyst, but it's the fact that there's so much about this that we still don't know. And it's so hard for me to understand that we don't have data on why people are getting revoked. And that sounds so wonky. But at least in Wisconsin, and Greg was alluding to this a little bit earlier, politics plays a role in all of this, right? And so until we can, in our state, agree on what the problems are, what the issues are, how can we change the system unless we agree? And in order to agree on what the issues are, we have to have the data. We have to know what's going on. Florida passed a really amazing data bill recently that is kind of the gold standard, the model for other states. And I would love to see more of that. I'd love to see Wisconsin do that. Just, to present the facts to legislators. Another piece that I always come back to about community corrections is there's a policy in Wisconsin where we don't have compliance credits. And so I'll just make up an example. Let's say you're sentenced to 5 years probation and you follow the rules for 4 years and 6 months. And in that 6th month of the 4th year, you get revoked and you get sent back. You don't get credit for that time that you served. You basically have to start over. And when I learned that was just another one of those things where you kind of think to yourself, well, that just doesn't make sense. And so there's a few just, pressure points or issue areas, whatever you want to call them, that kind of make you raise your eyebrows, I think, a little bit. And that's not to say that all of this isn't super messy and complicated. It certainly is. But I think those two things are, at least for me, the two that I keep coming back to.
Yeah, no, you got to take my answer, Julie. I should have gone first. I think the lack of data and the lack how hard it is to pass a data bill. Like, we're not talking about the reform. We're talking about just data, like collecting data that they have and how difficult that is to pass on anything. If it's supervision, if it's civil asset forfeiture, if it's sentencing, just having robust data, things that are publicly available, particularly when we're talking about the criminal justice system, where we give government the most authority to deprive you of your property, your liberty, and sometimes your life. And we don't have enough accountability and transparency involved in that process whatsoever across the board. There are some jurisdictions that have better data than others, and others that, are much more amenable to it. And Julie alluded to Florida. And Florida's a great example of passing a bill that looked great, and they're still having issues even implementing it because of just, bureaucracy. And so it just boils down to just so much that really stymies, progress. And if you don't have that data, you just keep spinning your wheels in the legislature under the dome in Madison because, it's the argument on back and forth, but no one actually has the hard data to argue. So it's all anecdotes. And so you'll get the person up there, well, I know a guy who thought was low level and then he committed this heinous crime, so that means we shouldn't do this. And then, when you don't have the aggregate data to support your facts, I mean, your argument, it makes it that much more difficult. One thing a little outside of community supervision, but it actually gets back into it in some ways. In Wisconsin, one of the craziest things I've heard is the offense of bail jumping. And so bail jumping is essentially, it sounds bad. It sounds like you have bail set and then you left and then you took off and you're in, you try to hop the border to Canada or something like that. So bail jumping essentially says if you're given bond, so that means just like if you're released either because you're accused of, a crime or you're accused of violating your conditions of supervision, if you violate any of the conditions of your release, that is considered bail jumping. So you come to court 10 minutes late. Now a prosecutor can throw a charge on you for bail jumping. And if you're charged with a felony, that bail jumping is a felony. And if you're charged with a misdemeanor, that charge is a misdemeanor. So being 10 minutes late, depending on what crime you have, could be a felony or misdemeanor. That tacks on another charge to you. I don't know anywhere else that does this. It's crazy that could be considered an offense. Normally, if you're late for for court, they might issue a summons for you or something along those lines. They might reschedule your hearing. If the judge is in a bad mood, maybe his football team lost the next day, maybe he'll throw you in for the jail for contempt for a couple of days. But the fact that they're able to tack on an additional felony charge to you is absolutely insane. And this gets back to a lot of the overcriminalization issues that we have. There are so many laws on the books that prosecutors can just stack against you for the exact same activity that it really causes this really distrust amongst law enforcement and the criminal justice system and in a lot of communities. And that's just another example of how this government overreach has really caused this erosion of community trust and values in law enforcement and criminal justice system.
Yeah, I do want to go back to the data bill that you mentioned just a while ago and how it's so hard to actually get the data. What is the rationale given for not wanting to adopt a data bill?
Money, bandwidth. Every time that you have a bill that comes out there with data, the agency says we can't do it with the resources that we have. Then the legislature is unwilling to provide more bandwidth for that, valid or not. I've never seen an agency that had a data bill that said that they could actually do it within their means as of now. And so you just kind of get this ping pong back and forth that any bill that has, a positive fiscal note or negative fiscal note, meaning that it's going to cost money, particularly in conservative states, because states have to balance budgets. And so anything that's going to cost money, particularly on the study side, it's just that much more difficult to get across. And so a lot of it is just potentially there's apathy to it, or they don't actually have the resources, or they want money, they don't get it, stays in the bill, and then it gets slashed away. And so those are kind of the reasons that you normally see those types of things. But a lot of it does have to deal with, things are best left in the dark. And so I know with civil forfeiture, when we've tried to pass data bills across the country, there's been a lot of pushback from law enforcement because I don't think that there's a lot of desire to open the books on a lot of some of the how forfeitures are acting. Is there a criminal charge associated with that? Is someone convicted after that? How is that money spent? How much of your agency is actually funded by forfeitures? And what type of reverse incentive are we allowing to continue in these agencies? So, it's a wide variety of issues, and some of it's just, there's not enough air in the sails for things. So there's a lot of reasons why, those bills don't pass. But Julie, if you have any insight as well there.
No, I mean, I think you hit that right on. I mean, it involves state agencies essentially having to change the way they do things, right? I mean, they just simply don't collect these data points, and things are different now, and we want to be able to search things easily, and that's just not how it was set up when they were set up decades ago, probably.
Yeah, thank you. So have either of you seen in your research or know of any if any, part that race plays in supervision revocations?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so from just an outset of, revocations are disparately impacting minority communities. Generally, I wouldn't have, I don't have hard numbers for you right now. I can certainly provide them, but a lot of it is, what we're talking about is, since there's not new criminal offenses that are required to revoke people back to prison from supervision, in areas where you have more police, you have more interactions with individuals, and all it really takes is for you to be just kind of messing up a little bit to be thrown back in prison. Folks that are in urban communities and higher density cities and things like that are obviously going to be much more likely to get revoked back to prison because they're having more interactions with police. So if you're in a suburban area or you're in a rural area, you're probably not going to be interacting with a lot of police officers at that point. So you're kind of able to skirt by, pretty easily on probation in a lot of regards. But if you're in a city, any interaction with a police officer can essentially turn into a prison sentence for a lot of folks. And so obviously that's going to disparately impact minority communities. So, probation reform really is a reform on some of the disparate impacts that minority communities are facing within the criminal justice system.
Just real quick, I'll add to that, only because I was looking at this exact question today. And so I have the number in front of me for Wisconsin. Wisconsin's population is about 7% Black. The population of people on community supervision in Wisconsin is 25% Black. However, the percentage of Blacks who are revoked from supervision is 42%. And so obviously that's 17 percentage points higher than the percentage of total Blacks under supervision. And so, yeah, I don't know what the reasoning, I think Greg did a good job of explaining some of that, but certainly does seem to impact them more, at least in Wisconsin, than what we've seen.
Yeah, thank you again for the insight. So one of our attendees is out in the San Francisco, California Bay Area as a substance abuse disorder counselor. They're seeing participants under the Promoting Recovery and Services for the Prevention of Recidivism. In regards to police reform, I know that's not the issue we're talking to today, but they asked if you guys had any opinions on that.
On that specific program, or generally?
I think in just general terms.
So, okay, so I think I kind of get it. Okay, so are they talking about co-responder teams, like utilizing non-police for, potential police intervention? So for example, there's certain jurisdictions, and this has been a big push right now in police, to handle, police calls instead of, just using the criminal justice system, bringing out, substance abuse specialists or someone who specializes in homelessness or a social worker up to that call to handle those individuals in a non-criminal justice fashion. And that's something that AFP has been very supportive of bringing in. A lot of the talk that's been going on with defund the police and, and everything along that line, it's a terrible phrase and terminology, because I think, but there is some value in understanding that, what we ask police to do is far beyond what that core value of protect and serve should be. So solving crimes, keeping communities safe, integrating yourself within the community, and and making yourself a part of that neighborhood is all a part of that core government function. But now we ask law enforcement to be mental health experts, substance abuse experts, homeless experts, fines and fees collectors, forfeiture collectors. We ask them to do all these non-police things, and so utilizing resources in a way that allows for individuals, these kind of frequent flyers, the same people that are on the streets that have addiction problems, homeless problems, getting thrown into jail over and over again, thrown back and forth and ping-ponging through that system, instead of actually just tackling the root of that problem in a non-penal way, is absolutely something that should be done much more often, as a better utilization of taxpayer dollars than what the status quo is right now. I mean, you ask any sheriff in a major city, they have one of the largest mental health institutions in the country, in their jails. And it's just them warehousing individuals, and they have no resources to actually deal with these people properly. In the criminal justice system, in a jail and prison is the worst place that we can throw people that have substance abuse issues and homelessness issues. And so allowing for diversion is a major part of this entire process. I hope I'm answering the question there correctly from what I garnered, but
from what I've seen, I believe that was a really good answer. So thank you. And so we've seen reform on community corrections in very statewide. Is there something that the federal government should be doing to get involved?
I mean, obviously, the federal system is separate from the state system. So they just kind of operate differently. The feds do actually cap interestingly, they cap their community supervision at 5 years, which I always come back to, and many states do as well. So I think that's interesting. I know they have done, and Greg would definitely be able to speak on this better than I, some recent reforms with the First Step Act. I don't know if any of that, Greg, was related to community supervision or not, but yeah.
Yeah, so two things. So one, on the First Step Act, so that allowed for more time. So I'll step back. The federal system is a truth in sentencing system. So you have to serve 85% of your prison sentence behind bars. That last 15 or so or whatever else can be on, supervised release. So you have a probation officer that you work with, and that cap is at 5 years, like Julie said. And they also don't have parole. So they eliminated parole in the 90s, which triggered a lot of other states to do that, like Florida, Arizona, Virginia, where they all eliminated parole, Wisconsin. Yeah. And so one thing they could do is reinstate parole. That would be a major thing, because right now you have to serve 85% of your sentence. So, having these types of incentives at the federal level just are non-existent, because everyone knows that they're going to be serving the max sentence that they have. And so there's no incentive, even if they have programming offered, to participate in programming. There's no way that you're going to spend less time until the First Step Act was passed. And so there are a certain amount of folks, depending on your sentencing criminal history, that if you do participate in programming, you'll actually be able to reduce your time behind bars and convert that into time on supervised release. And so that was one of the major provisions of the First Step Act. But there is a lot of exceptions to that. There's 25 different offenses or even longer that are exempted from actually having that earned credit at the federal level. But yeah, I mean, two things I would love to see: an expansion of earned credit from the First Step Act, reinstitution of parole, and actually geriatric parole and medical parole, the expansion there. So there's a couple bills floating around at the federal level that would allow for individuals that have underlying health conditions, or if they're of old age, or if they have, a chronic condition that they're not going to recover from, to actually be medically released. That is used so few and far between, that it could really be something that can be expanded and utilized more often, because, you shouldn't have to die in prison when you have a chronic heart problem or something along those lines. And this actually came in quite a bit right now with COVID. And so you had individuals with underlying health conditions that really getting COVID was pretty much turning into a death sentence for them. Within prisons, COVID has been spreading rapidly. And so a lot of individuals at the federal and state level have been getting released based upon medical release, but we'd like to see more of that continuing after this pandemic has occurred.
Yeah, well, thank you, Julie and Greg. And as we close out, is there any last words you'd like to leave our audience with?
I'll just say, as I'm skimming the last comment in the chat box, there are lots of issues with the system. However, what I always come back to, and I always like to close with, is that very few people actually serve a life sentence. Like very few people die in prison, to be blunt. I think it's only like 5% or less. So therefore, 95% of people in prison today will be coming home at some point. Most will be coming home in probably less than 2 years. So therefore, there should be an incentive. That in itself should be an incentive for people to just want them to integrate back into their community better, want them to be contributing members of society. in Wisconsin, and this is just one other kind of pressure point that we're dealing with now, is we have overcrowding issues. And so either the state will have to figure out a way to lower the prison population through legislative reforms, or we'll have to actually build a new prison. And so we have many states across the country who have successfully closed prisons, and we're talking about potentially building one. And that's just at regular, like today, like we could build a new one today because we're overcrowded. So, you know, I think there are incentives, and whether it is money for some people, but to me, what I always come back to is the fact that these people are coming back, and we'd rather them come back and not return. And so that's just kind of a last thought for me.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, if prison worked, if the current system worked and we saw people go in and they got their punishment, they never did anything again, we were spending billions and billions of dollars, you know, each year on this system, and it was making us safer, you know, I think, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it's just not. And so we're sending people back to prison, and you see these, these recidivism rates. I think in Wisconsin, you know, I think it's about 40% of people after they get released from prison are back behind bars within 3 years. I mean, that is such an utter failure of a government agency. You know, if any other government agency or anything else had that type of failure rate, you know, there'd be systemic changes. Should not stop because of the guise of public safety that surrounds the criminal justice system. Like, we have to monitor everything like that, just like any other provision, just like education, just like healthcare, just like a business. I mean, you cannot have these types of failure rates and continue to rationalize the type of spending that we're doing to keep this sustained. It's the only, you know, really one of the only government agencies that actually, the more it fails, the larger it gets. And so we really have to recalculate, what are we actually doing here? If we're not actually seeing better results, if the whole thing is this is supposed to help public safety and it's exacerbating the problem, why are we continuing to do the same thing over and over again? There really is no rationale for the current system, either in Wisconsin, a lot of places across the country. And so I think we need to be better stewards of taxpayer dollars. I think we need better stewards of public safety. And I think we need to be better stewards of how we value life in this country and how throwaway the criminal justice system has become. And so, you know, there is a lot of progress. You know, I've been working on this for about 5 to 6 years, and I've really seen, you know, going from lawmakers being incredibly uneducated on the issue, not understanding it, not what's going on, to slowly understanding, to now wanting to lead and champion legislation across the country. And so as this has gotten more, you know, elevation as an issue, I am more hopeful for reform, but there's a long way to go because there are a lot of problems they've been baked in for decades now. So, you know, hope, but a lot of more work to do.
Well, thank you, Greg and Julie, and thank you all for joining us for tonight's event. If you have any questions for them, I put my email in the chat box so you can reach out to me, and I'll connect you guys later on so they can answer any of your unanswered questions. And I hope you all are able to join us for next week's discussion with AFF Nashville on June 30th for a discussion on police reform. Again, if you have any questions, my email is kirsten@americasfuture.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.